Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your little coffee break, refreshed, networked, and caffeinated. So, for our next speaker, we have Dr. Hernan Ceres from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and his talk is entitled Shifting the Emergency Management Paradigm Towards a System Approach to be Better Prepared for the Risks of Emerging or Re-emerging Health Threats. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hernan Ceres.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and well, I hope that you're all enjoying this day as much as I've been enjoying it. I think there were a lot of talks that basically prepare my talk in a way, so I'm gonna jump through all the context, all the background, and we'll go to the important bits and pieces of this shifting paradigm that we'll go over today. So, in general, how do we handle emergencies? Especially in the animal health sector, we don't have a lot of means. We basically have massive die-offs of animals. So we've seen it with animals like wildlife in Africa. We've seen it with several other diseases. We vaccinate or we depopulate. Those are three options. So today, when Mark was talking about the different options and doing the analysis of the cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness, basically, those are the things that we're comparing. What do we do? What sort of intervention do we do? What are the benefits? An important thing is that often the decision is much more complex than that because we have direct and indirect effects of what we decide to do. So, for example, you can decide to do a depopulation, but that can affect the livelihoods of thousands, if not millions of people, and also their food security. So often, even if the decision looks like a direct decision, this is what we should be doing, it's much more complex than that. A good example of this case is avian influenza. When we decide to depopulate, we know that many lose their livelihoods and food security. So these are complex decisions. Even though it may look like a very direct and straightforward way of doing or very straightforward intervention, we know that there are unintended effects that we can have at the social demographic dimension. The same thing, if we look at it from these sort of three ways of intervening, is it enough for the possible impacts and consequences, especially of novel diseases? When we have these interventions, we often also have a delay in the time that we have the implementation of said action or the different options. So something that we've noticed, again, with HPI over the last years is that how is it started affecting multiple species and decimating whole communities. So even though the effect, the activity in a way of what we're seeing is animal die-off, we know that there's also a huge biodiversity issue happening in the background, and there will likely be more complex effects at an ecosystem level. So we haven't lived in a connected world as the world today has never been the same, basically. It's hyper-connected. You can be in the other side of the world. You can, in 24 hours, you can move products, you can move animals across the whole world, and we just don't think about it in a way. It's just the new normal. But this can also have unintended consequences when we're thinking about diseases and emerging and re-emerging diseases in particular. Mostly, these unintended consequences are linked because of the complexity of the systems. Here we see these are three types of drivers, basically. So green are environmental, the blue it's in terms of public health, so it's a public health aspect. And then in the red one, we see it as a socio-demographic dimension. So you can see that even though when we're looking at infectious disease threats, these are complex systems. So these decisions that at the start, they look very straightforward, simple, 1, 2, or 3, A, B, or C, they become much more complex. And often we don't know the unintended consequences of the actions that we may be implementing. So in this new environment where we have a hyper-connected world, when we are moving and trading goods, products, animals, we see this emerging diseases environment shifting. We see it something that we believe was very straightforward in a way. Now it's shifting, and we are delayed basically in the way that we can have that information and have the right information to make decisions. Especially under an emergency, you can imagine how uncertain that space is. So when we look into this complexity, on top of everything, we're looking at a new global threat. Well, it's not new, but basically a new and novel system and how that is shifting, which is climate change. With that, we see often how the same environment can look like a prairie, then a few months later, it can look like a complete desert, and then it can look like a lagoon. This is the same place, by the way. So you can imagine how that affects the ecosystem, affects vectors, affect the animals, the population, and the people that live in this environment. So what we see, an emergence of vectors, for example. This is an example of Rift Valley fever and how this shifting environment created new areas with water that were never there before, and now we have cases in areas that we were not supposed to. So again, we go back into this question, is it really enough for climate change? I think we often try to create the models and have as much information as we can, but are we really going at the speed of the change that is required to the system to adapt, that is required to the system to actually go beyond the three sort of classic approaches and have a better understanding of the complexity that lays behind the system? This is from Chile, actually. So it's just an example of, we wanted to show that how a non-sanitary emergency can trigger a sanitary emergency by affecting a population. This was never supposed to happen. It's a peri-urban area, but due to climate change, there's a huge drought, and people have to move. You have migration as well, and you create these high-risk environments where you have these threats that obviously trigger from a non-sanitary emergency, you have then a sanitary emergency. And then, as we were looking at it before, we have this new pest of occurrence. So this is, these are the flies, so these are larvae, it's a screwworm. So it's re-emerging in Africa and in the Americas. We see something that was supposed to be eradicated in the 90s, huge programs, big investment from multiple countries, and now we see it reappearing. So again, the question is it really enough what we're doing? Not only in the everyday, but also when we are facing an emergency, will it be enough? So now we had the experience, right? We lived through a pandemic. It wasn't long ago. Everyone that is here had that experience. So we can say if it was enough or if it wasn't enough, what we were doing before and what we're doing after it. And we can also think and we can reflect, will it be enough for a next event like that? Even if it's not a full-on pandemic, is it enough for a full-blown epidemic of a virus, of a re-emerging or an emerging disease? So we can reflect on those aspects, and we have several examples of how these diseases are increasing their prevalence, are increasing the incidence, are moving, are especially changing their transmission routes, etc. So will it be enough? That's the reflection, basically. So under those conditions, like, are we ready for the next emergency? When we see this changing environment, it's shifting at a speed that often the policies and the interventions are not necessarily up to the challenge. So under this changing environment, what are we doing in a way? So we go back to the question is that, are we ready for the next emergency? And this is not just thinking about a pandemic. Let's think about the pest. Are we ready for those? And in most cases, unfortunately, it seems like we're not. So even though we had the experience of COVID, what we are seeing, and Jorge actually mentioned it, in FAO we have several tools. We often carry out assessments. So this is based on the Progressive Pathway for Emergency Preparedness, which is a self-assessment tool that provides a baseline for countries to assess their own preparedness for an emergency. And unfortunately, most countries, they say no. And this is a self-assessment. So you can understand that when a country tells you we're not ready, it's because they're not ready. So that's why we took this as an opportunity to change the way that we are approaching emergencies, shifting from hazards, so hazard-based approach for an emergency, to an adaptive emergency system. We are basically articulating multiple aspects of prevention, aspects of emergency management, and we are creating a more flexible, adaptive, and articulated system that can be resilient to emergencies. So what does it mean? It's basically, instead of looking at we have multiple threats coming at us, we try to make a system that can actually sustain and respond to different emergencies, notwithstanding of the hazard. So this is in the natural disaster approach, they call it the all hazards, basically. So that's why in the FAO Emergency Management Center, our goal or objective is to strengthen agri-food emergency management through a One Health system-wide approach. So we are looking at systems. We're taking a step back, not looking necessarily into the specific hazards that are threatening the countries or the regions, but looking at the system, how we can make a stronger system, a system that is more resilient to the emergencies. So for that, we have the system approach, and we consider that is the future of resilience to emergencies. Instead of having this hazard-based, we try to create a system that can be improved by having an ongoing preparedness approach, improved response, improved coordination, and improved learning, which is active learning. So basically a system that relies on these different aspects to strengthen the system itself and to have a system that can actually respond to multiple threats. So that's why when the EMC was created in 2006 as the Crisis Management Center, it was focused on avian influenza. Then again, we went from one specific hazard to multiple diseases in animal health. But something that we've seen more and more, and unfortunately more often than ever, is that we cannot have a sectoral approach. When we have a sectoral approach, we leave a window open, we leave a door open, and easily we can have a hazard, we can have a threat that becomes an actual emergency. So that's why now we're taking this system approach to emergencies, and it goes in line with the change of name, actually, that now it's the Emergency Management Center in FAO. So the Emergency Management Center relies on the operational branch in a way, which is the Office of Emergency and Resilience, this is a whole division that works on the emergency management, being that natural disaster, livelihoods, humanitarian disasters. And then we have the technical components, which are sectoral. It's a sectoral expertise that comes from the animal health sector, from the plant and plant health sector, and fisheries and aquaculture. We also now have, we're developing collaborations with forestry, and the whole idea is to have this multi-stakeholder interdisciplinary approach from emergency to emergencies. So taking the sectoral expertise, because we need that sectoral expertise. We cannot just be generalistics for everything, but integrating and creating spaces where that expertise can come into play and can interact with multiple other sectors and get the most and the best out of them under an emergency. So that's why we basically work in these 4 different areas, which is preparedness, response, coordination, and collaborations and resource mobilization. And under each one, we have multiple activities. The main thing is that under preparedness, we have capacity building, capacity development, being that, for example, participating in master student programs. We have courses for where we teach emergency management, not only to students, but also to veterinary services and other stakeholders that participate, that are part of the emergency management system. We have also certain specific assessments, like the one that I mentioned, the progressive pathway for emergency preparedness, but also we have after-action reviews, for example, which is something key because we need to take that active learning approach to the interventions and to learn from what we've done so we can improve the systems. Then we have response, which is response missions per se. So these are emergencies where the teams deploy to the countries and they go and help the countries build resilience during an emergency. And coordination, where we have agency platforms to improve the way that multiple agencies respond and work together during an emergency. And then finally, resource mobilization and collaboration, which is exactly as the name says, is to increase collaborations and actually make more efficient use of the available resources, because we know that often we have more needs than resources. So we need to be very efficient on how we use them and avoid any duplication. So in terms of preparedness, these are some of the guides. So we have the 2011 and 2021 Good Emergency Management Practice Manual, but also you can do the online course. It's a 25-hour online course. It's freely available. It's in 5 different languages. The whole point is to increase the knowledge of what emergency management is. We cannot have, as I said before, a sectoral approach to it. So we build a common language, we build a common understanding. In a way, we build a common culture for emergency management. And then we have what we call the GEMP toolkit overview, which is the ongoing revision of the FAO GEMP manual. Then we have specific advanced manuals for animal health, for example, emergency operations centers, after action reviews. We have the same manual, but focusing on biothreats. Then we have the self-assessment, the progressive pathway for emergency preparedness, and we have applications to plan health emergencies. So this is basically we build up the system of emergencies and how we can then take a sectoral approach, adapt those tools, adapt those processes to multiple sectors. Finally, we have the country training and implementation, including the online course that I was mentioning. So the whole point of that is creating, as I said, this culture, this workforce for emergency management, where we can just go and deploy or go and discuss with the multiple stakeholders, but everyone understands the same language. Finally, this is the guide of the Emergency Operations Center that I mentioned. But the whole point of the whole process of this toolkit, this ongoing process of learning, is to increasing resilience of FAO members to emergencies. The whole point of that is strengthening the system with the goal of avoiding big events that affect a whole region or multiple or a country, and therefore impacting and having large consequences on the population and affecting their livelihood, their food security, and their health in general. So this is just an example of one of these international interagency coordination groups. So this is, you can see the multiple agencies that are part of the group. This is just an example, but basically it can be triggered by a health event, or it can be triggered because there's an increased need for coordination. So this happens a lot during an emergency when you have multiple NGOs, individuals, international organizations, all basically going to the same place and trying to do what they can. So the idea of this, again, is to use the resources in an efficient manner. So the emergency preparedness cycle in general, it's just a never-ending story. And this is the take-home message. Basically, it's something that never ends. We often pursue this gold standard, the gold standard of the manuals, the gold standard of the guides, the gold standard of the processes. The gold standard here is that it's a never-ending process. You're always learning, you're always improving. So by doing that, you always have planning, you equip your system, you train the people, you train everyone, not just the people that are in the national services, but also the people that live, your citizens on emergency. You test them, you review, and you improve your plan again. And this is the never-ending cycle of emergency preparedness. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep. I didn't see anyone, so I'm happy. And you can see the email on the bottom if you have any questions, but I'll be here in any case. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Herna, for that thought-provoking question. We have questions from the audience. Yeah.
Maybe you can go first. Okay. Thanks for your excellent presentation. Indeed, pandemic preparedness is the one thing that we can do to prevent the health crisis and emergencies. However, in recent times, in East Africa and Central Africa, the monkeypox broke out. And very tragically, it's a collective failure of the international public health community so that they couldn't make the vaccines being available in Africa to save lives. Even a single life matters. And then, how do you see your operational plan and national system strengthening connecting to the technical side of the operation, and how do you synergically approach on the field in response to save lives? Do you feel that it's important, or do you feel that the DEX work, the communication, coordination, and collaboration is enough?
Well, I think you answered your own question, right? We see the consequence, and be that inaction or be that a lack of proper coordination, you see the consequence of that. In any case, what we can do is to learn from what happened and try to look for options on how to make it not ever happening again. Now, we can try our best, and definitely from the international organizations, I can say that we try our best. But there are multiple levels at the same time. We saw that complexity of the systems, and I think what you mentioned is a very good example because of all the levels and the different actors that come into play. In this case, we see that the intervention is a vaccine, right? But the complexity of the system, from the production to the deployment, it's a whole different discussion, and I think we can spend a whole week trying to unravel that and how it works. But I think you, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think you answered your own question. Is it enough? No, certainly no. Can we do better? Yes, always. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Hernan. I like it so much. In fact, preparedness is key, no doubt about that. However, there's another word that I believe that we are not using properly, which is anticipation, because we know already around the world which are the most important hotspots of potential emerging diseases. So just 4 years ago, at the starting of the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Organization for Animal Health more or less calculated the need approximately of $18 to $27 million invested per year during 10 years in order to do this kind of anticipation work. And this was less than 1% of the cost of the pandemic. Taking into account the recent experience, it's still difficult to understand why we are not going to the origin, to anticipate, trying to stop at the very beginning, because when you see those fires, we're already late in general terms. So how can we anticipate those problems from your point of view? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's a key question. The how can we do it? And I don't think there's going to be one actor capable of doing it. Is international community, is engagement at the country level, is engagement at the local level. How can we transfer, and we saw it this morning, how can we transfer an international plan of implementation to actual implementation on the ground? So this, I would say, is a chain of the discussions that we need to have. But you mentioned something, and I think we've been sort of throwing the term of we need to do prevention, upstream prevention of drivers for disease emergence. But in the end, I think we're falling into the same trap of what does it mean? How can we do it? And as you said it, I think we know where, we know some mechanisms, even if we are still not 100% sure of mechanisms, like we're still having some, like in some cases the risk goes up, in some cases the risk goes down, and you think that, well, that we were supposed to have higher risk. But it's another discussion. But in that sense, the engagement of multiple actors, having strong engagement at the international community, but also at the country level, on how we can engage and advocate for exactly what you said. Preparing and anticipating the risks is always, or is most of the time, is going to be cheaper than dealing with an emergency. Often we talk about an emergency, basically, if you would have prevented it, it's around between 1 to 5% of the cost of the actual emergency. We have our own data that is the same. So we always joke, but in a way, when we don't get emails, when we don't get calls, we're happy, because it means that we are not needed. We're the emergency management center. We don't want to be called. But when that happens, you know that it's going to be a huge need for not only financial resources, but resources in general. Because it's not just the emergency, it was also comes after. It's a reconstruction, it's a recovery. And how do you build, like I think lately we've been talking more and more about building back better. And that's also a key. Okay, we cannot deny the fact that we will have emergencies. We can be better prepared, certainly. Can we avoid a lot of this? I think so. But we need a strong commitment at multiple levels, and I think that's why we're here in the end. And the event today, it shows that commitment from international organizations to academia to individuals, that there's that commitment. And I think that's certainly a hope for something better in the future.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? If not, thank you, Dr. Herna, for that wonderful talk.